Herman Webster Mudgett was born on May the 16th, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, the third child of Levi Horton Mudgett and Theodate Page Price. His parents were devout Methodists, and his father a farmer, trader and house painter. However, the latter was also allegedly a heavy drinker, and reportedly treated his family incredibly cruelly. Herman grew up to attend the Phillips Exeter Academy, and he would end up graduating high school with honours from Gilmanton Academy at the age of 16. But it wasn't without misfortune, as he was also heavily bullied at school by children who were often envious of his outstanding academic capabilities. At one point, the other children forced Herman to stand in front of a human skeleton, putting its hands on his face to try to scare him. However, though it terrified the boy at first, he actually ended up finding the experience rather intriguing, and later claimed that it helped him overcome his fear, in which he started to grow a strange obsession with death and began the dissection of animals. At the age of just 17, on July the 4th, 1878, Herman married 18-year-old Clara Lovering in Alton, New Hampshire, and the following year he enrolled at the University of Vermont. However, he was incredibly dissatisfied with the school and dropped out after just 1 year. Housemates described his relationship with Clara as abusive, as he was often very physical towards her. It was around this time when Herman's first presumed murders took place, around the Chattanooga, Tennessee area. He supposedly murdered 56-year-old train conductor William C. Berman and allegedly stole his identity while running from a series of other murders in the North Georgia area near Dalton, but this all remains unconfirmed. It's impossible to know for sure when exactly his first murders actually took place. On February the 3rd, 1880, Clara gave birth to their son, Robert Lovering Mudgett, and 2 years later, Herman transferred to the University of Michigan's Department of Medicine and Surgery. It was at the start of 1884 when the relationship seemed irreparable, and Clara returned home to New Hampshire with their son and barely made any contact with her husband going forward. By June, despite a mediocre academic performance, Herman still managed to graduate from the university before relocating to Moores, New York. It was here when a rumour began to spread about him being spotted with a young boy, who ended up mysteriously disappearing. However, Herman informed authorities that the child simply returned home to Massachusetts, and no further investigation was done. During this speculation, Herman relocated once again to Philadelphia, where he was hired as a keeper at Norristown State Hospital, though he quit after just a few days. He gained work at a local drugstore, but not long after, a young boy died after taking some medicine that he had purchased there. Mudgett denied any involvement in his death, but like before, he left the city. He relocated to Chicago, Illinois in August of 1886 and changed his name to Henry Howard Holmes to avoid being exposed by the victims of his previous crimes. He gained work in an anatomy lab under Professor William James Herman, who was the chief anatomy instructor. The duo allegedly began grave robbing in order to provide the medical supplies, and Holmes would later admit to using real cadavers in order to defraud life insurance companies during his college years. He soon found work at another drugstore at the northwest corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street in the Englewood section of Chicago, owned by Elizabeth Holton. Holmes proved to be an incredibly hard-working employee, but it was then heavily rumoured that he murdered her husband, Dr. E. S. Holton, who was an elderly man dying from cancer, but nothing is confirmed. Regardless, after his death, Holmes took over the store and actually bought it from Elizabeth, who was struggling to run it by herself. However, he never actually paid her, so she attempted to sue him but eventually dropped it and moved to California, though some believe that Holmes murdered her as well. By the end of the year, despite still being married to Clara, Holmes tied the knot with 24-year-old Myrta Belknap in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Just a few weeks after the wedding, Henry filed for divorce from Clara, claiming infidelity, but as the claims couldn't be proven, this went nowhere, and it's unlikely that Clara was even made aware of it at all. The divorce was never finalized, and Holmes remained married to 2 women at the same time. It was in 1887 when he bought an empty lot across the street, and it was this very purchase that would end up ensuring HH Holmes would forever live on in infamy. He soon began the construction of a 2-story, mixed-use building with apartments on the 2nd floor as well as retail spaces and a new drugstore on the ground floor, later being dubbed the Murder Castle or the Holmes Hotel. However, he faced legal action during the construction as he refused to pay the architects or the steel company Actner Iron and Steel, which led to them taking him to court in 1888. On July the 4th the following year, Myrta gave birth to their daughter, Lucy Theodate Holmes, and the family lived together in Wilmette, Illinois, though Henry would spend the majority of his time in Chicago tending to his business ventures. A couple of years later, he began seeing yet another woman, 31-year-old married Julia Smythe, who had moved into his building, working on his pharmacy's jewelry counter. Julia was married to Dr. Lawrence Achilles Connor, and the pair had a 5-year-old daughter together named Pearl, but once he discovered the affair with Holmes, he promptly left her. Smythe ended up gaining custody and remained at the hotel with Holmes and her daughter. On April the 17th, 1891, Holmes's 68-year-old creditor, John Dibrow, died of apoplexy inside the hotel's own drugstore. He supposedly collapsed shortly after Henry was seen pouring black liquid down his throat. However, despite this eyewitness account, foul play was still ruled out, though it was later discovered that his life was insured and Holmes did financially benefit from his death. It was that same year when Emily Van Tassel, who also worked in the drugstore, completely vanished. She was listed as a potential victim of Holmes for years, including by her own mother, but nothing definitive was ever proven, though there's conflicting reports as to whether he mentioned her name or not in his later confessions. On Christmas Eve in 1891, both Holmes's mistress Julia Smythe and her 5-year-old daughter Pearl completely disappeared. Holmes informed investigators that Julia had to leave unexpectedly due to her dying sister, but then his story changed and he claimed that she actually left to avoid her ex-husband, which altered again to suggest that she had died during a failed abortion. Holmes did have the medical history, but it was concluded that he just would not have had the experience to have tried to conduct an abortion himself. He would later confess to poisoning Pearl, most likely to avoid her finding out that he had already murdered her mother. By 1892, Holmes added a 3rd floor to the building, telling investors and suppliers that it was going to be used as a hotel during the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition, but it was around the same time when his stenographer Kitty Kelly also disappeared without a trace. There were also rumours of him murdering Kate Durkee during her time at the hotel, which Holmes himself even confessed to before she was actually located, very much alive. Around the time of his later arrest, several exaggerated stories circulated regarding the hotel, most of which were entirely fabricated. The story was that Holmes used the Columbian Exposition to lure tourists inside, to murder them and then sell their skeletons to nearby medical schools, but officially there is no definitive evidence of him killing anyone who was visiting the exposition. The Yellow Press claimed that the building contained torture chambers, trapdoors, gas chambers, and even a crematorium in the basement. There were even reports of the building having over 100 rooms, being laid out like a maze with certain doors leading to brick walls, windowless rooms, or dead-end staircases, all of which were completely fictitious. In reality, the 3rd floor was a standard size, described as being rather unremarkable and not even being finished due to the dispute with the builders. There were some hidden rooms, however these were simply for hiding furniture that Holmes had purchased on credit which he never intended to pay for. In May 1892, 23-year-old Emmeline Cigrand was hired by Holmes to work in the building as a secretary, supposedly due to her connection to a doctor who had allegedly managed to peddle a vaccine that was supposed to cure alcoholism. She and Holmes reportedly began a relationship, but witnesses who saw her in her final weeks claimed that she had completely lost interest in the man. She was last seen in December 1892. Her parents were informed that she left town to marry a man by the name of Robert Phelps, though authorities were convinced that she actually fell pregnant with Holmes's child, and it was another failed abortion of his that he had attempted to cover up. Her empty luggage trunk was sent back home to her mother in Indiana, but the truth was beginning to emerge. It was in 1893 when 24-year-old actress Wilhelmina Williams, though many refer to her as Minnie, moved to Chicago. Holmes would later claim to have met her in an employment office, though it's believed that they actually first crossed paths years earlier in Boston under his pseudonym Harry Gordon. He hired her as the hotel's personal stenographer, and managed to even persuade her to transfer the deed to her property in Fort Worth, Texas to a man named Alexander Bond, who in reality was just yet another one of his own aliases. The next month, Holmes and Williams pretended to be married and rented an apartment together in Chicago's Lincoln Park, when her 18-year-old sister Anna decided to pay a visit. It was on July the 5th, 1893, when she wrote to her aunt about her plans to accompany Holmes to Europe. Quote, "Brother Harry says you never need trouble any more about me, financially or otherwise. He and sister will see to me. I hope our hard days are over." End quote. Minnie and Anna were never seen again. It was that same year when John Davis visited the 1893 World's Fair, but completely disappeared, and would later be legally declared dead. By November, Harry Walker supposedly had life insured to Holmes for $20,000, and often wrote to friends regarding working for him in Chicago, before also completely vanishing. While working in a chemical bank building on Dearborn Street, Holmes met 38-year-old carpenter Benjamin Freelon Pitezel, who had a criminal past himself and soon became the right-hand man for H.H. Holmes and his future behaviour. Holmes even transferred the aforementioned deed for the Williams property over to Pitezel himself, under the alias Benton T. Lyman. On January the 17th, 1894, H.H. Holmes married Georgiana Yoke, despite still being married to two other women at the same time. In June 1894, both Holmes and Pitezel took George Thomas to a swamp in Mississippi on the Tombigbee River, before murdering him and disposing of the body. Holmes would later confess to this crime to his second wife. The next month, Milford Cole received a telegram from H.H. Holmes requesting him to travel to Chicago, but he was then never seen or heard from again. It didn't take long for some insurance companies to attempt to prosecute Holmes for arson, leading to him leaving Chicago in July of 1894 and heading to the Williams property in Fort Worth, Texas, where he again attempted to build another incomplete structure, all without paying the suppliers or contractors. He was arrested and jailed for selling mortgaged goods in St. Louis, Missouri. But during his time inside, he struck up a conversation with convicted outlaw Marion Hedgepeth, who was serving a 25-year sentence. Together, they came up with a plan of Holmes taking out a life insurance policy on himself for $10,000 and then faking his own death in order to collect, even promising Hedgepeth $500 in exchange for the name of a lawyer who could be trusted. Holmes was bailed out of jail and found St. Louis attorney Jeptha Howe, who loved the plan and agreed to assist, but this entire scheme failed as the insurance company became far too suspicious and refused to pay up. According to Holmes, this wasn't the first time that he had attempted to fake his own death, claiming that he had murdered a doctor by the name of Robert Leacock, who resembled him, in an attempt to stage his own passing. However, there was no corroborating evidence of this, so it's believed to have been another false confession. Their plan B, however, was for Pitezel to fake his death instead, so that his wife could collect the money, which would also be split with Holmes and Howe. The plan was for Pitezel to set himself up as an inventor in Philadelphia under the name B.F. Perry, who would then tragically be killed and disfigured in a horrific laboratory explosion. But unfortunately, this wouldn't go according to plan. On September the 4th, despite their previous agreement, HH Holmes knocked Pitezel unconscious with chloroform and then set his body on fire with benzene. He would later claim that Pitezel was still alive after the chloroform, but the forensic evidence suggested that it was actually used after he was already dead. Not only did Holmes collect on the life insurance payout, but he was even able to manipulate Pitezel's grieving widow Carrie Alice Canning into giving him the custody of 3 of their 5 children: 13-year-old Alice, 9-year-old Nellie, and 7-year-old Howard. Holmes and the 3 children travelled throughout the northeastern United States and Canada, though he did also escort Carrie along the way as well, using several fake names and lying to her about her husband's whereabouts, claiming that he was hiding out in London. Sadly, Holmes would later admit to murdering the children by forcing them into a large boot of a car and locking them inside. He then drilled a hole into the lid and put one end of a hose through before attaching the other end to a gas line to completely asphyxiate them. He proceeded to bury their naked bodies in the cellar of his rental house in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Philadelphia detective Frank Geyer was then assigned to investigate H.H. Holmes and the missing children. He was tracked down and followed to the rental home in Canada, where the decomposing bodies of the children were discovered in his cellar. Quote, "The deeper we dug, the more horrible the odour became, and when we reached the depth of 3 feet, we discovered what appeared to be the bone of the forearm of a human being." End quote. They also found unsent letters written by the children that Holmes had kept. Upon further examination, information on his Chicago property was discovered, as well as in Indianapolis, Indiana, where he had another rental home. It was revealed that Holmes had visited a local pharmacy to get some drugs, which were then used to murder Pitezel, as well as a repair shop to sharpen the knives that he used to chop up the body before burning it. Some teeth and bones were also discovered inside the chimney. Emmeline Segran's skeleton was soon discovered by investigators at the home of a Chicago physician who had been aided by M.G. Chappelle, both of which admitted to having articulated at least 3 skeletons on behalf of the man himself. On November the 17th, 1894, H.H. Holmes was tracked down in Boston, Massachusetts by the Pinkerton National Detective Agency and finally arrested. He was held on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas as the authorities had become much more suspicious, and it seemed he was preparing to flee the country with his innocent and unaware 3rd wife. During the full investigation, the bank book of Lucy Burbank was found, along with some human hair in a chimney flue at Holmes's hotel. The building was thoroughly searched, but as there was no definitive way to identify the victims found, there was no opportunity to convict Holmes of any of the crimes in Chicago. A piece of a human bone was discovered which could have belonged to Julia Connor, and the remains of a child were also found, possibly from her daughter Pearl, but it was impossible to know for sure. They found a burned gold watch chain and burned dress buttons, possibly from Minnie Williams. But in the end, he was only tried for the murder of Pitezel, as it was the clearest case they could actually convict for. Holmes was also reported to have murdered 2 people in Lake County, and their remains were later found on a farm decades later. But their identities were unknown, and it's unclear if he was even responsible. It was in August of 1895 when 2 men were spotted entering the back of the Holmes Hotel at around 9 p.m, and about 30 minutes later they were seen exiting and quickly running away. This was followed by several explosions before the building completely went up in flames. Investigators would find a half-empty gas can underneath the back steps, but the building did manage to survive and remained in use for decades, before being torn down and then later used by the United States Postal Service. In October 1895, HH Holmes was put on trial and found guilty, concluding that he also murdered the 3 children and was sentenced to death. It was at this point he confessed to 27 murders in Chicago, Indianapolis and Toronto, as well as 6 other attempted murders, a confession that rewarded him $7,500 by the Hearst newspapers. He claimed that his usual method of killing was to suffocate his victims using various means, such as chloroform, lighting gas fumes, trapping them in an airless vault, but sometimes he also resorted to starvation or burning them alive. It was on May the 7th, 1896, when H.H. Holmes was hanged at Moyamensing Prison, and reportedly he remained extremely calm, showing very few signs of fear, anxiety, or depression. However, unlike most hangings, his neck didn't break, and instead he was left being strangled, slowly dying for around 15 minutes before finally taking his last breath. To deter grave robbers, Holmes had requested for his coffin to be contained in concrete and to be buried 10 feet deep. As requested, his body was interred in an unmarked grave at Holy Cross Cemetery in Yeadon, Pennsylvania. But the story of H.H. Holmes was far from over. In 1909, Hedgepeth, who was actually pardoned the rest of his sentence for informing authorities on the deal he had made with Holmes so many years earlier, was shot and killed by police officer Edward Jaburek during a hold-up in a Chicago bar. On March the 7th, 1914, former caretaker of the Holmes Hotel, Patrick Quinlan, passed away, and it was now considered impossible to determine the true extent of the damage done by H.H. Holmes. He committed suicide by taking some strychnine poisoning, and left behind a note saying, quote, "I couldn't sleep," end quote. His relatives claimed that he had been haunted for several months and had been suffering severe hallucinations. Henry's son Robert Mudgett grew up to become a certified accountant and city manager of Orlando, Florida, passing away on November 3rd, 1956 at the age of 76, and his daughter Lucy went on to become a public school teacher, passing away on December 29th that same year at the age of 67. But for years there was also speculation that H.H. Holmes wasn't dead at all, and that he finally managed to get his wish and faked his own death, escaping execution. This led to speculation that he not only fled the country, but possibly made his way over to London, England, causing theories that H.H. Holmes was Jack the Ripper. It wasn't until 2017 when the body was finally exhumed and tested with the blood of his descendants. As the coffin contained concrete, the body hadn't decomposed as it normally would. His clothes were almost all perfectly preserved, and his moustache was even still intact. And after DNA analysis and over 100 years of mystery, it was concluded that the body inside the grave was in fact H.H. Holmes, and he was not Jack the Ripper, leaving everyone in the world seeking answers.